2 years ago, the Appalachian Mountains claimed another victim, or so it seemed. Richard Miller, a seasoned hunter, father of 2 and husband, had walked into those ancient forests as he had many times before. He was no careless wanderer. He was a man who respected the wild, who treated each journey into the mountains with almost ritual discipline. Before leaving, he always marked his routes on a map for his wife Susan, listed the timings of his return, and carried his trusted rifle, provisions, and GPS navigator. His trips were a way of recharging, a private communion with nature, and he always returned until that one autumn day. When he did not appear, concern turned to panic, and then to something darker. The Appalachians, with their whispering legends of people swallowed whole by the forest, seemed to have taken him, yet the truth, buried under roots and waiting for storms to reveal it, would prove far more horrifying. What began as a missing persons case would soon unravel into a tale of violence, secrecy, and a hidden killer lurking in the shadows of the wilderness. When Richard Miller did not return on Monday evening, as he had promised, his wife Susan tried to calm her unease. Perhaps he was exhausted from the trek, or perhaps the weather had turned foul and forced him to rest at the trailhead. In her heart, she believed that Richard was too disciplined a man to break his own rule. But as Tuesday dawned and there was still no sign of him, panic replaced patience. She called the sheriff's office, her voice trembling, hoping they would treat it as urgent. At first, the officers responded with professional calm. It was not unusual, they explained, for hunters to return a day late. Yet when they drove out and found Richard's truck neatly parked at the trailhead, untouched, with no disturbance, the unease began to spread beyond his family. The first days of the search were powered by cautious optimism. Those who knew Richard believed that if anyone could survive in the wilderness with an injury, it was him. The man had grown up in those forests. He knew the rhythms of the land, the ways of animals, the changing moods of weather. Volunteers joined the sheriff's men, fellow hunters, locals, even strangers touched by the story. They carried torches, ropes, radios, and a determination born of hope. The woods echoed with his name. Richard, Richard, carried on the wind. Dogs were brought in, trained to track scent. At first, they pulled eagerly, following Richard's trail from the pickup. But after a few hundred yards along the rocky path, the scent dissolved into nothingness. The dogs circled, confused, whining, their noses pressed to the soil, only to lift their heads in frustration. Again and again, they were returned to the starting point, and again they lost the trail. To those watching, it was unsettling, like the forest itself had swallowed him. Helicopters joined the effort, hovering above the canopy, scanning ravines and clearings. Yet the Appalachian forest in autumn was no easy ground. The trees formed a thick ceiling, blotting out sight lines. From above, the wilderness was a patchwork of reds and golds, beautiful but impenetrable. Days turned into a week, each hour draining hope. Not a scrap of cloth, not a footprint, not even a snapped branch gave them comfort. In villages and cabins near the mountains, whispers began to rise. The older folk recalled stories passed down generations, tales of the Appalachians as a place that did not forgive intrusion. Some spoke of hunters who vanished without leaving behind so much as a shadow, of spirits that guarded the ridges, of mountains that consumed those who underestimated them. These were legends born of centuries of fear and reverence, and though the rescuers dismissed them, the silence of the search made such stories harder to ignore. The volunteers, many of them men and women who had known Richard personally, felt the weight of these whispers. Around the campfires at night, conversations turned somber. Was he lying somewhere with a broken leg, slowly fading, or had something darker taken him? Bear attacks were considered, but there was no sign of blood or torn gear. Robbery was ruled out, his truck was untouched, his wallet and phone still inside. It was as though the forest had absorbed every trace of his existence. Day after day, search parties combed streams, checked gorges, and scoured the ridgelines. The sheriff's office mapped every sector, ticking them off with military precision. But maps and human order meant little in a land shaped by time and chaos. The mountains were vast, and a man alone could be lost forever within their folds. The optimism that had carried the first week began to wither. By the second week, hope was no longer voiced aloud. It remained only in the eyes of his children, who asked each evening whether their father would be home by tomorrow. When winter's first chill arrived, reality grew harsher. Snow threatened to blanket the ground, making the search impossible. To call off the operation was to admit defeat, and yet there was little left to search. The official report would soon mark him as missing under unclear circumstances, a phrase that felt like a death sentence without a body, a mystery sealed by silence. For Susan and the children, there was no closure, only absence. Each knock at the door, each ring of the telephone set her heart racing, only to crash back into despair when it was not news of Richard. For the community, it became a story retold with unease. The hunter who walked into the mountains and never returned. For some, it was tragedy. For others, proof of the old tales. And for the detectives, it was a puzzle, with no pieces, something that gnawed at their professionalism, because a man like Richard did not simply vanish. The forest had given nothing back. Not his rifle, not his gear, not his life. The legend of the mountains swallowing a man whole had, at least for now, become Richard Miller's truth. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Richard Miller's disappearance, and the once determined search was losing momentum. Snow threatened to fall any day, and the official teams were preparing to suspend operations. The family's hope had dimmed, the volunteers were exhausted, and even the sheriff's officers admitted quietly that the trail was colder than winter itself. Then, just when all seemed lost, a discovery jolted the search back to life. A group of volunteers, men who knew the wilderness almost as well as Richard had, strayed into a hollow some 3 miles off the expected route. It was a place away from the main trail, quiet and secluded, almost as though hidden by design. There, beneath the fallen leaves, they spotted something ordinary and yet deeply unsettling: the remains of a small campfire. The ashes were still distinct, not yet fully washed away by rain or scattered by wind. Judging by their condition, the fire had been burning no more than a week earlier. The discovery electrified the search party. For the first time there was proof that Richard had not simply vanished into thin air. He had been here. He had sat down, lit a fire, and left behind this trace of life. Hope surged once more. Perhaps he had tried to wait out an injury. Perhaps he had taken shelter here. Yet hope quickly turned to confusion. Why had he come so far from the route he had meticulously planned? Richard was not a man who wandered aimlessly. He valued order, safety, and predictability. If he had said he was heading to the old observation tower, then that was where he would go. So why was he here, in this secluded hollow, miles away from that direction? As the volunteers examined the spot more closely, one of them noticed a metallic glint amidst the leaves. He bent down and retrieved 2 spent shell casings. Their caliber matched the rifle Richard had carried. This was no mere coincidence. He had fired his weapon here. That detail deepened the mystery. If the shots were for hunting, where was the kill? No carcass, no remains of an animal, not even blood on the soil. If the shots were a distress signal, why only 2? Why not 3, the universal number for signaling help in the wilderness? And if there had been danger, why had he left everything else behind? The scene offered no answers, only questions. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no disturbed earth. The fire, the casings, and silence, those were the only clues. Even the dogs, brought eagerly to the site, circled and whined, but could not pick up a trail leading away. It was as if Richard had vanished a second time, right from this very hollow. Investigators could not ignore the most baffling absence of all: his belongings. Richard was never careless about his gear. His backpack contained food, water, tools of survival. His rifle was his companion in the wild, yet none of these were here. A hunter does not abandon his equipment, especially when survival might depend on it. The very thought of him walking away empty-handed clashed with everything people knew about his character. Among the searchers, theories began to circulate in low voices. Some whispered that perhaps he had been ambushed. Others suggested he had encountered someone he knew, or someone dangerous, and the confrontation had driven him off course. But speculation had little weight against the oppressive silence of the forest. By the time officials examined the site, the sense of unease was heavy in the air. The ashes told them Richard had been alive there within days of the search beginning. The shell casings tied him to the spot beyond any doubt. But why here, and why this strange disappearance of gear and trail, nobody could say. For Susan, the discovery was a cruel twist. It gave her proof her husband had survived longer than anyone feared, but no clarity about what happened next. Was he taken from the site? Did he wander away under duress, or had something darker played out in that hollow? The sheriff's office attempted to approach the puzzle rationally. They checked maps again, considering whether Richard might have taken a detour to track game or avoid danger. They re-examined the hollow from every angle, looking for disturbed soil, broken branches, or any clue of a second presence. Nothing emerged. In the community, however, folklore once again crept into the conversation. The mountains, they said, were known to confuse even the wisest of men. People spoke of strange disappearances, of hunters who were led off the trail by whispers in the wind or lured into places where no one should be. These stories, half remembered and half believed, gained strength as the rational search failed. It was easier, perhaps, to believe in the mystery of the land than to accept the terrifying possibility that a crime had taken place. The campfire remains, and the shell casings, though small details, shifted the story from an accident to something more sinister. It was no longer simply a man lost in the wilderness. Someone had fired a weapon. Someone had left in a hurry, abandoning logic and gear, and that someone, beyond question, was Richard Miller. The investigation moved forward, but the truth remained buried. The fire and the casings stood as haunting markers in the forest, a reminder that Richard's disappearance was not natural, not ordinary. It was an event shaped by unseen hands, by choices or forces still hidden. For the detectives, it was the beginning of a new line of thought. For the family, it was another wave of torment, proof that he had lived, but also proof that he had stepped closer to danger. And for the mountains, silent and watchful, it was just another secret absorbed into their vastness, waiting for time to reveal what men could not yet see. 2 years had passed since Richard Miller's disappearance, and the forest had grown quiet again. The search parties were long disbanded, the media had moved on to fresher tragedies, and even the most persistent rumors had faded into the background noise of local folklore. Richard's name still lingered in hushed tones at family gatherings and in the corner of the village taverns, but most had accepted the painful reality that no answer would ever come. Then, nature itself shifted the story. It began after a season of violent storms. Heavy rains lashed the mountains, rivers overflowed, and winds tore through the valleys with an anger unseen in years. In the aftermath, tourists hiking along a little-used trail stumbled upon a sight that seemed at once ordinary and extraordinary. A great oak tree, centuries old, had been uprooted by the storm. Its massive roots, once hidden deep in the soil, jutted skyward like the ribs of some fallen beast. At first glance, it was just another casualty of the weather. But beneath the tangle of roots, partly exposed where the earth had split, lay something that stopped the tourists in their tracks. A scrap of fabric, discolored yet still recognizable as clothing, and near it, a weathered backpack. Word traveled quickly, and within hours, the authorities were back in the mountains. When they arrived, they saw the same thing, a backpack, trapped under the roots, and fragments of clothing half buried in the soil. The items were old, but unmistakably human. Slowly, with care, they began to clear away the debris. The backpack was opened, and inside were personal effects that brought a shiver of recognition. A small knife, a compass, a battered notebook, all items known to have belonged to Richard Miller. For the first time in 2 years, the missing hunter had resurfaced, or at least his belongings had. As the excavation continued, a more chilling discovery emerged. Bones, human bones, entangled within the roots and soil, partially crushed by the weight of the fallen oak. The skeleton, though weathered by time, was largely intact, Yet its positioning was what struck investigators most. It was not sprawled, as though a man had collapsed. Rather, it was curled, almost pressed into place. To the trained eye, this did not suggest accident, but intent. The body appeared hidden, deliberately lodged where it might never be found until nature tore the tree from the ground and betrayed the secret. Forensic teams, now summoned in full, took what remained to be studied. The results were decisive. The skeleton belonged to Richard Miller, but it was not nature that had taken his life. His skull bore fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. The injuries could not be explained by a fall or by the shifting of the tree roots over time. This was no accident. Richard Miller had died by violence. The revelation shook the community anew. For 2 years they had debated whether Richard had wandered off, succumbed to exposure, or been claimed by some tragic twist of the wilderness. Now, those explanations collapsed. He had been killed, and his body hidden beneath the oak. The forest had not swallowed him. A human hand had ensured his silence. The detail that unsettled investigators most was the precision of the concealment. Whoever placed Richard beneath the oak seemed to have known that the great tree's roots would shield the remains. It was a hiding place, chosen with cunning. For years the body had lain undisturbed, while searchers combed the same forest, unaware that the answer lay just a few feet beneath their boots. The discovery ignited speculation once again. Some believed Richard had been ambushed by a stranger, perhaps a poacher or drifter. Others whispered darker theories, that he had been betrayed by someone he knew, someone who understood his habits and roots. The shell casings discovered earlier now took on new significance. Had there been a struggle, shots fired in warning, before the fatal blow was struck? For the family, the emotions were tangled. At last they had proof of what had happened. Richard had not simply walked away, he had not abandoned them. He had fought, suffered, and been silenced. Yet the truth was incomplete, for the killer still walked free. The sheriff's office, now under pressure to deliver justice, reopened the case. Evidence from the backpack, from the bones, from the very soil around the oak was examined with forensic intensity. The fractures on the skull revealed a weapon of blunt force, likely something heavy, swung with intent. The placement of the body beneath the roots showed calculation rather than panic. This was not a crime of passion alone, it bore signs of forethought. The forest, silent as ever, had given up its secret, but not its whole story. For investigators, the fallen oak became a grim symbol. Nature itself had intervened to reveal what man had tried to bury. What storms could unearth, no human cunning could conceal forever. In the village, whispers returned. Some saw the storm as divine retribution, a reminder that truth cannot remain buried. Others, more pragmatic, felt only dread. If someone was capable of killing Richard Miller and hiding his body so cleverly, then that someone had lived among them undetected for years. The discovery beneath the oak did not close the mystery, it deepened it. It proved that Richard's end was no accident of wilderness or fate. It was murder. And it forced everyone, from family to authorities, to confront the darker reality. The hunter had not been taken by the mountain. He had been taken by another human being. The case had shifted irreversibly. Richard Miller was no longer a missing man. He was a victim. And the mountains, once accused of swallowing him, now stood as the silent witness to a crime that only time and storms had the power to reveal. The revelation beneath the uprooted oak changed everything. What had once been a missing person case was now confirmed murder. The community, which had long oscillated between hope and despair, found itself thrust into a new phase, one that demanded accountability. The authorities, under pressure to provide justice, returned to the evidence with renewed urgency. The backpack discovered under the roots became the centerpiece of forensic examination. At first glance, it appeared weather-beaten, its straps frayed, its fabric stained by soil and rain. Yet within those seams and folds, investigators uncovered something decisive: traces of DNA. When compared against the profiles stored in regional databases, one match stood out, almost leaping from the records. It belonged to Johnny Barrett. Barrett was not an unknown figure. He had lived on the edges of the same community, a man whose reputation straddled the line between rugged survivalist and troublemaker. He was no stranger to hunting or the mountains, and more than once had been involved in heated disputes over land boundaries, access to trails, or rights to hunt in certain zones. His name had been murmured before in connection with Richard's disappearance, but in the absence of proof, those murmurs had faded into the background. Now, the evidence was undeniable. Richard's backpack bore Barrett's DNA. When Barrett was brought in, he carried himself with the same stubborn defiance that had long marked his dealings with neighbors. The initial questioning began in a controlled, methodical manner. Investigators laid out the timeline, the recovered items, and the forensic results. Barrett responded with flat denial. He claimed he had nothing to do with Richard's disappearance, that he had never seen the man on the day in question, and that the DNA must have been transferred by accident, perhaps from some prior encounter. But as the hours stretched on, the cracks began to show. Interrogations, after all, are not battles of words alone, they are tests of endurance. Barrett, once brash and dismissive, began to falter when confronted with the specificity of the evidence. The DNA had not been incidental, it had been found deep in the lining of the backpack, suggesting close and recent handling. His refusal to explain only tightened the noose of suspicion. Finally, after long hours and mounting pressure, Barrett's posture shifted. The denial softened into grudging admission. He confessed that there had indeed been an encounter with Richard in the forest. According to his version, it had started as a confrontation about territory. Richard, he claimed, had accused him of trespassing into a zone he regularly hunted. Words escalated into shouts, shouts into shoves, and soon the situation had spiraled beyond control. Barrett described it as a fight gone wrong. He insisted he had never meant to kill. He painted a picture of panic, Richard lunging, himself defending, a strike delivered in fear rather than malice. The fatal blow, he claimed, was an accident, a tragic outcome of tempers running too high in the wilderness. Afterwards, terrified and confused, he had hidden the body beneath the oak, believing the roots would cover his mistake, never intending for things to unravel in the way they eventually did. For some, this confession might have been enough. It provided a narrative that explained the presence of his DNA, the concealment of the body, and the long silence that had followed. But the investigators, seasoned in the language of lies and half-truths, were not satisfied. The evidence, after all, told a story of its own. The fractures in Richard's skull were not consistent with a single panicked blow. The injuries suggested repeated strikes, delivered with force and accuracy. This was not the flailing of a frightened man, but the calculated violence of someone determined to silence. Moreover, the very act of hiding the body beneath the oak spoke less of panic and more of planning. To drag a man's remains to such a place, to press them deliberately under the roots where they might never be found, this required composure, not terror. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Barrett grew agitated. His voice rose, his hands clenched, and his earlier story began to shift under the weight of contradiction. At times he insisted it had all been a mistake. At others he lashed out at Richard's memory, painting him as the aggressor, as though the dead could be blamed for their own fate. Yet every alteration only deepened the sense that the truth was still being withheld. In the court of public opinion, the case ignited fierce debate. Some villagers, long suspicious of Barrett's temper and isolationist ways, saw the confession as confirmation of what they had always feared, that he was capable of murder. Others, swayed by his portrayal of panic and accident, wondered if it had truly been a moment of rage gone too far, rather than cold-blooded intent. Around kitchen tables and in tavern corners, theories flourished once again. But for Richard's family, the distinction mattered little. Whether through accident or intention, their husband and father had been taken, and the man responsible now sat under lock and key. Closure, though partial, had come. Yet even as the confession echoed through the town, the sense of unease lingered. The official investigation pressed forward, compiling every scrap of evidence into a case that could stand in court. The forensic data, the testimony of Barrett, the physical condition of Richard's remains, all painted a picture darker than the one Barrett wished to tell. The suggestion of intent was strong, the signs of panic weak. The law would decide what the truth really was. And so, the story turned once more. From disappearance to discovery, from discovery to confession, the path was winding, treacherous, and steeped in ambiguity. Barrett's words, his shifting tone, his attempts to recast the past became as much a part of the mystery as the silence of the forest itself. What had begun as a hunter's vanishing act now stood, revealed as human violence, layered in denial and half-truths. The interrogation room had stripped away Barrett's bravado, but it had not yet stripped away the shadows of doubt. For in the end, a confession is not the same as clarity. And as investigators prepared their case, one fact alone was clear. Richard Miller had not fallen to chance. He had fallen to human hands. Johnny Barrett never stood before a judge. Before the trial could even begin, he died in custody under circumstances that remain the subject of speculation. For Richard Miller's family, this news was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they finally had a name, a face, and a confession. On the other, the man responsible would never face the scrutiny of the courtroom nor bear the weight of a formal sentence. Justice, in its official form, slipped through their fingers. The town was left with uneasy silence. Some said it was poetic Barrett paying the price in a way no judge could deliver. Others felt cheated, robbed of the closure that a verdict might have brought. For Richard's widow and children, the grief was not erased. They carried the knowledge of what happened, yet with it came the haunting truth that the system had not delivered its promise of justice. And so the case closed in an atmosphere of relief mixed with lingering shadows. The forest that had swallowed Richard became more than just a wilderness. It became a reminder of how human hands can be more dangerous than nature's storms. Even now, whispers about that oak and the years of uncertainty hang in the air like mist, refusing to disperse. Stories like these remind us that the line between mystery and truth is often fragile. They leave us asking not only what happened, but also why it happened the way it did. If you found this case as unsettling and thought-provoking as we did, join the discussion in the comments. What do you think? Was Barrett's story of panic believable, or was it cold-blooded intent? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of true crime and unsolved mysteries, where every question opens the door to another chilling possibility.